Somewhere on the Bowery, some year in the late 1890s, a stouter woman than she had been at 25 walked out onto a New York vaudeville stage on the arm of the man who had been her father's coachman. The paying audience knew who she was. That was the point. She had been the delight of one of the richest immigrant financiers in the country, and she had married the stableman. And this was where the fall ended. She was not the only one. For 50 years, from 1860 to 1910, at least 70 such women had made the same trade. There was the Carnegie niece, whose uncle overruled her mother. There was the daughter of Frank Work, capped for the rest of her life at $80,000 a year. There was the Westchester bride, who lost her pew and her town in one Sunday. And there was Victoria Morosini. 4 women, 1 class rule, 1 final question about what a fortune is really for. Before you meet any of them, do me one favor. If you love these stories, the quiet ones the family accountants preferred to keep out of the papers, hit subscribe. I write these to be watched slowly, and I want you here for the next 4. Chapter 1. The Stouter Woman on the Bowery Stage. The New York Herald described her later, in one long sentence that took a magazine reporter 3 tries to file, as an enigma who would so remain unless she chose to surrender her secret. The reporter was writing about a woman who had once, in 1884, been perhaps the most talked about person in the country. He had been sent to see what was left of her. What was left of her was a Bowery vaudeville turn. She came out onto the stage in a black veil, and heavier than she had been at 25, and her husband, a man the same reporters had once described as a dirty stableman who washed his clothes in a horse trough, walked her up to the boards. He was in the wings within a few steps. He was not in the act, or perhaps he was. It was hard to say, in those years on the Bowery, where the act stopped and the marriage began. She sang. She danced with a mandolin in her hand. The Herald reporter noted, in the careful way of a paper that had been running her name on its front page for a decade and a half, that she was not a particularly gifted singer, and that the audience had not come for the song. They had come to look at her. They had come, in the plain phrasing of the era, to see how far a millionaire's daughter could fall. Her name was Victoria Pertinax Morosini. Her father, before he cut her out of his will, had been Jay Gould's business partner and one of the richest immigrant financiers in New York City. Her husband had once been her father's coachman. In September of 1884, she had eloped with him, and her father had spent the rest of the year and the next several years of his life trying to undo the fact of the marriage by every private mechanism his class had ever devised, and had failed at all of them, and had eventually settled for the cheapest and cleanest of the era's punishments, which was to cut her name out of the ledger and never speak it again in the house that had been hers. She was one of at least 70. That is not a rhetorical figure. A scholar of the phenomenon, Carolee Klimchok, has documented in the New York papers and the country's provincial press at least 70 separate press-reported cases between 1860 and 1910 of American heiresses who abandoned their inheritances to marry their family's coachmen, their footmen, their riding masters, and, in the extended definition the papers used, their family secretaries. Klimchok reports that she is confident the real figure is significantly higher because the wealthiest families in the country had a well-practiced and well-paid ability to keep these stories quiet, and the ones that reached the papers were the ones the family had failed to suppress. The papers of the time called it an epidemic. The cartoonists drew the coachman as a demonic seducer stepping down from the box. The parlor joke was that the modern equestrian coachman needed to be replaced by an automaton with a clockwork body that could be wound up and made to bolt for Canada if any young lady of the house attempted to run away with him. The people who found this funny were, in many cases, the same people whose daughters were riding to the park at 5 o'clock in the afternoon in the family carriage every day of the week, in the fashionable coaching hour. With the very coachman, the cartoon was drawn about sitting up on the box in front of them. That is the shape of the joke. That is the shape of the class rule. And it is also the shape of what this video is about. For the next 3 hours, in 4 segments, we will follow 4 of those women. We will begin with Nancy Carnegie, the youngest daughter of the Coke and Steel Carnegies, who married her riding master in the spring of 1904, and, alone among the 4, kept most of her share of the family fortune because her famous uncle publicly overruled her mother. We will then follow Frances Ellen Work, the daughter of a Wall Street millionaire named Frank Work, who married a Hungarian riding master in 1905 and, on her father's twin instruments of a forced divorce and a rewritten will, ended a $15 million inheritance capped for the rest of her life at $80,000 a year. We will then follow Ella Tice, a Westchester Baptist bride who married her family's black coachman and lost, in the space of a single Sunday morning, her pew, her family, and her town. And we will end where we began, with Victoria Morosini and the coachman and the Bowery stage. The question at the bottom of these 4 stories, and the question this video is finally about, is what a fortune is really for. Because in every case the woman knew, before she signed the certificate, exactly what she would lose. She weighed the fortune against the man in full daylight. She named her price. She paid it. That is not the story of a woman manipulated. That is the story of a woman who had already made the trade. She stayed on the Bowery stage for years. Her husband stayed with her. And in the end, in a passage of the Herald we will return to at the close of this video, a reporter would notice that she had grown stouter and that her hair, the glimpse of it he could see behind her black veil, was still brilliant and without a trace of age or grief. Chapter 2. What a fortune was actually for. The Gilded Age had built, into the daily performance of its own wealth, the physical intimacy that would eventually give it away. This is the first thing to see about the whole phenomenon, and it is the thing the era's own cartoons and jokes never quite acknowledged, because the joke was on the very people making it. The coaching hour ran in Central Park at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and its purpose was performance. The purpose was that a New York family whose fortune was recent enough to require this kind of display would ride around the Bethesda Terrace and the Sheep Meadow and the Bow Bridge in a carriage of the correct kind, driven by a coachman of the correct kind, and be seen by the walking public. The walking public was not the same class as the family. The walking public was the entire New York working middle, the shop girls and the clerks and the tourists off the boats from Boston and Philadelphia, and the ritual was the industrializing city's substitute for a court. The rich family got to be looked at. The walking public got to see what a fortune looked like. The coachman was the front of that performance. He sat on the box. He was the visible surface of the family. He was hired, according to the research Carolee Klimchok has done in the period letters and household records and hiring advertisements, partly for his looks. Klimchok's phrase for him is trophy servant. He was tall, well-featured, clean-cut, in the era of the fashionable European accent. He was often deliberately imported, so the family could show off an English or an Irish or a French coachman in preference to an American black coachman. And if he did not have a certain physical presence, he did not get the position. That was the hiring rule. The daughter of the house rode behind him in the closed carriage for 2 hours every afternoon of the season. She sat in the open barouche on the summer excursions. She saw him at the door of the coach house at 7 in the morning when she rode out to the country. She saw him at 11 at night when the carriage returned from Delmonico's, and he handed her down off the running board. The chaperonage system that governed her every other interaction with a man of her own class did not apply to him, because he was not, in the family's own mental accounting, a man in the sense the chaperone was there to worry about. He was the furniture of the fortune. The result, over 50 years, was 70 documented press-reported marriages between the daughters of the coach and the men on the box, and, by the reasonable estimate of the scholar who did the counting, a great many more that never reached the papers. The family's responses ran in 4 instruments. The first was disinheritance. This was the cleanest and the most public, and the one the papers loved. It was also, contrary to the popular assumption, the least reliable, because it depended on the fortune being in the father's or the mother's discretionary hands at the moment of the daughter's marriage. In the case of the Carnegies we will meet in a moment, the fortune was already tied up in a shared trust across 9 children, and the mother could not, without dismantling the whole trust, cut one daughter out. In the case of the Works we will meet after that, the fortune was in the father's will, and he wrote 13 codicils to it, the 13th of which cut his daughter out, and then, on his deathbed, wrote a 14th that restored her on precisely engineered terms. The second instrument was the convent. It was Catholic, it was continental, and its use on a Protestant daughter was a public signal that the family had lost patience. Victoria Morosini spent time at the Sisters of St. Joseph after her elopement, either voluntarily or under family pressure, and the record does not tell us cleanly which. The convent's function was to remove the daughter from the visible New York social calendar for a season or 2, during which the family hoped either that the marriage would collapse or that the papers would move on. The third instrument was the asylum. In its rawest form, this was the private commitment of a rebellious adult daughter to an institutional facility, on a physician's writ, on the family's application, without the daughter's consent. Nellie Bly had, in 1887, exposed the mechanics of the practice in 10 days in a madhouse, which ran in the New York World, and the practice's public reputation had never recovered, but the practice itself continued. Klimchok's research documents that families in the coachman elopement cases did, in some proportion of the 70 documented, use committal, or the threat of committal, to try to break the marriage. The fourth instrument, and the one the era used most theatrically, was the Pinkerton. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency had grown out of the wartime intelligence apparatus of the 1860s, had become in the 70s and 80s the private security wing of American capital, and by the 80s was known in every American paper for its work against organized labor, and, in a smaller and quieter sideline, its work for wealthy families in domestic crisis. Giovanni Morosini's use of Pinkertons against his own daughter, in the days after her September 1884 elopement, is the era's most famous single case of a father sending private detectives after a daughter across state lines. It was not exceptional. It was the ordinary escalation available to a fortune of the Morosini scale. Set against all 4 instruments was the reciprocal trade the era's fathers preferred. From 1870 to 1914, roughly 100 American heiresses of the same class as Nancy Carnegie and Fanny Work and Victoria Morosini were married into the British and continental aristocracy. In the transaction, the papers eventually named the dollar princess trade. The most famous single case was the 1895 marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt to the Duke of Marlborough. The dollar princess trade was the polar opposite of the coachman elopement. The same class rule that pushed daughters upward into peerages punished daughters who chose downward. Andrew Carnegie, whose defense of his niece Nancy's marriage we will come to in a moment, would use the phrase "worthless duke" in his public statement on that marriage. He knew exactly where he was aiming. That is the world these 4 women lived in. 4 instruments of paternal power. 1 reciprocal transaction the class preferred. a coaching hour in Central Park at 5 o'clock. And, at the beginning of every one of the 4 stories that follow, a coach. Chapter 3. The Niece Who Outmarried a Duke. In the spring of 1904, in a Roman Catholic priest's rooms in New York City, Nancy Trevillo Carnegie, aged 23 and youngest daughter of the Coke and Steele Carnegies, married her riding master. The ceremony was private. The witnesses were few and are not named in the surviving press. The priest was Catholic, which mattered, because the Carnegie family in the maternal line was Presbyterian on Cumberland Island, and the marriage of a Carnegie daughter by a Catholic priest was itself a small transgression that the family, at the moment they learned of the marriage, was not primarily focused on. They were focused on the groom. The groom was James Heaver. He was Irish-born. He had, some sources say 2 years earlier, some sources say 3, come out of the Carnegie household in Pittsburgh, where he had been employed as a professional riding instructor and had opened his own riding academy on 7th Avenue in Manhattan. He was in the loose but unambiguous American sense of the 1890s a servant. He was the man who taught the daughter of the house to ride. He had, before he opened his own academy, been in the employ of Nancy's mother, Lucy. He was not, by any reading available to the New York or Pittsburgh society press of the year the marriage broke, a man a Carnegie daughter was supposed to marry. The marriage was concealed from the family for something over a year. In June of 1905, more than a year after the wedding, Andrew Carnegie himself made the announcement to the wire services, and the story broke in the American papers and was syndicated within days as far as the Australian press, where a Grafton newspaper called the Clarence and Richmond Examiner ran the story on the 20th of June 1905 under the headline Mr. Carnegie's Niece, with the subhead Secret Marriage to a Coachman, and where the West Gippsland Gazette in the Victorian town of Warrigal ran on the same day a headline reading Mr. Carnegie's Niece, with the subhead Her Secret Marriage, the Millionaire Satisfied. The subheads capture, better than any single American paper on the day, what made the story unusual. The Carnegie in the headline was not the mother who had employed the riding master and had refused to attend the wedding. The Carnegie in the headline was the industrialist uncle who had come out of his Fifth Avenue front door and told the reporters that he was, in the world's coldest phrase for the world's warmest emotion, satisfied. To understand the size of what Andrew Carnegie was doing in that moment, it helps to set his own life against the family into which his niece had married. Andrew Carnegie had been born in 1835 in a weaver's cottage in Dunfermline, Fife, in the industrial Scottish lowlands, the son of a hand-loom weaver whose trade the power looms of the 1840s had bankrupted. The family had emigrated in 1848, in the year of European revolutions, to Allegheny City, Pennsylvania. Andrew had gone to work at 13 as a bobbin boy in a cotton mill for $1.20 a week. By the time he stood on his front doorstep in June 1905 and told the wire services that his niece had married better than most of his peers' daughters, he was the richest self-made man in the United States. And his statement about a niece marrying a riding master carried, from a man of that biography, the weight of a statement about the American promise itself. He said, in the Wire report, that his niece had done better in marrying a sober, moral, good man, without wealth, than most of the daughters of his peers had done in marrying, in the phrase for which the statement was afterwards remembered, a worthless duke. The line was aimed at the dollar princess trade. It was aimed at the Vanderbilts, whose daughter Consuelo had been married to the Duke of Marlborough at Blenheim 10 years earlier. It was aimed at the Frank Work strategy of holding a fortune inside the American, non-titled ledger. It was aimed at every American family of great wealth that had, in the previous quarter century, sold its daughters into the European aristocracy for cash and title. The uncle of a young woman who had married her riding master, standing on the pavement of Fifth Avenue in the summer of 1905, was telling the reporters that his niece had, in his considered opinion, made the better trade. The mother did not think so. Lucy Coleman Carnegie was the widow of Thomas Morrison Carnegie, Andrew's younger brother and business partner, who had died in 1886, leaving Lucy in charge of the family's coke interests, the Fifth Avenue townhouse, the Pittsburgh residence, and the estate that would define the family in the memory of every one of its 9 children. Dungeness on Cumberland Island in Georgia, a 60-room limestone and tabby mansion set on 18,000 acres of subtropical Barrier Island. Lucy had spent the 1890s expanding the island, buying additional acreage, laying out sibling houses for each of her 9 children as they grew, one of which was Greyfield, and one of which was Plum Orchard, and one of which was the house she was building for Nancy. Lucy Carnegie was, by the time of Nancy's marriage, one of the wealthiest widows in the United States. She was also, by every account of the family that survives from Cumberland Island in the years around the wedding, furious. She refused to attend the marriage. She refused, in the first months after the news broke, to receive the couple. She wrote no public letter to the papers because writing a letter to the papers was not what a woman of her position did with a private family matter. But she also did not appear in New York on the day her brother-in-law made his statement, and she did not sit with him in any of the photographs the wire services placed in the American papers in June 1905, and the reading the entire American Society press placed on her absence was that the mother did not agree with the uncle. That reading was correct. Chapter 4. A sober working man rather than a worthless duke. Andrew Carnegie, the richest self-made man in America, stood in front of his own front door and told the reporters, on the record, that his niece had married better than most of his peers' daughters. That statement was one thing. What made the statement work as a rescue of Nancy's fortune was a second thing, and the second thing lived 100 miles inland from Cumberland Island in a lawyer's office in Pittsburgh, in the trust document Lucy Carnegie had signed after her husband's death. Thomas Carnegie had died in 1886. He had left an estate of approximately $10 million, or by the standard cost of living conversion in the accountancy of 2025, approximately $340 million. He had left it, in the American manner of the 1880s, in a discretionary trust to his widow, with the understanding that Lucy would provide for each of the 9 surviving Carnegie children in turn. Lucy had done what a certain kind of widow of the 1890s did, which was to bind the fortune down. She had, in a series of legal instruments through the 1890s and the earliest years of the 1900s, tied the coke interests and the New York and Pittsburgh residences, and above all, Cumberland Island itself, into a shared sibling trust. The trust's structure was designed to keep the island intact for the family across the coming century. It was designed to give each of the 9 children a house on the island and a share of the coke income. It was designed to make sure that no one child, and no one child's marriage or divorce or legal settlement or bankruptcy, could pull the island apart. The consequence for Nancy, in the summer of 1905, was that her mother could withhold her personal favor. Her mother could withhold the invitation. Her mother could refuse to receive James Haver in the Fifth Avenue drawing room or on the veranda at Dungeness. What her mother could not do, without dismantling the whole 9-child trust and without cutting off her other daughters and sons in the process, was cut Nancy out of the family's Cumberland Island share. The instrument Lucy had built to keep the island safe from lawyers and bankers had, without anyone in the family fully seeing it at the time it was built, made itself safe from Lucy too. The The trust had been the mother's protection against the outside world. It became, at the moment, her youngest daughter married a riding master, the daughter's protection against the mother. Andrew Carnegie's public sanction of the marriage was the second half of the same rescue. Once the industrialist uncle had told the wire services that he approved of the marriage and had used the phrase worthless duke to define what the alternative had been. The American society press could not brand Nancy a social outcast without also, by implication, branding Andrew Carnegie's judgment as defective. That was not a trade any New York editor was prepared to make. The uncle's endorsement removed the possibility that Lucy could isolate Nancy socially. Nancy kept her invitation to the Cumberland Island houses on the trust's authority, and she kept her invitation to the Fifth Avenue tables on the uncle's authority. And between the two authorities, there was no room left for the mother's disapproval to bite. The psychology of that rescue is what makes the segment sit at the base of this anthology's ladder. Andrew Carnegie was, in origin, the parvenu. He had been born in a weaver's cottage. He had come to the United States as a poor immigrant boy of 13. He had risen, in a single lifetime, to a fortune larger than any single American lifetime had ever accumulated before him. He was, in one sense, the least likely defender of a Carnegie daughter's marriage to a riding master, because a self-made industrialist of that arc had the greatest personal reason to police the class boundary he had himself just crossed. In another sense, he was the most likely defender, because he had lived on both sides of the boundary and could see from Fifth Avenue that it was a boundary the papers took more seriously than the fortune itself. The parvenu is the man best placed to know that the fortune does not care who the daughter marries. Lucy Carnegie was the opposite figure. She was the daughter of William Coleman, a Pittsburgh coal and coke industrialist who had been Thomas Carnegie's business partner. She had come into the Carnegie family from her own money, which was Coleman money, and her instinct on Nancy's marriage was the Coleman instinct rather than the Carnegie instinct. The Coleman side of the family had held its own class boundary with the same firmness the older Pittsburgh industrial families all held theirs. A Coleman daughter did not marry the riding master. Neither, in the Coleman reading, did a Carnegie daughter. It was because she was a Coleman by birth, and only a Carnegie by marriage, that she found herself, in the summer of 1905, taking a position her husband's older brother did not take. The younger daughter did not, in the surviving contemporary record, produce a public quote on any of this. Nancy Carnegie Heaver is one of the most silent of the women in this video. She did not, so far as the wire services or the New York papers or the Cumberland Island family memoirs record, sit down with a reporter to explain herself. That silence is the second unusual thing about the segment, and it is a silence with its own meaning. It suggests, alongside the mother's refusal to receive, that even a rescued fortune came at a private cost the daughter did not choose to lay out for a paying audience. She had kept her share. She had lost her mother's welcome. James Heaver himself is thinly documented. Contemporary sources agree he was Irish-born and Catholic, and worked as a professional riding instructor. Some sources say his given name was James, some say George. Some later Cumberland Island family accounts, filed decades after the marriage, describe him as an alcoholic, a description which contradicts Andrew Carnegie's public statement that he did not drink, and which should be read as later family reconstruction rather than a documented fact of 1905. What can be said from the contemporary record is that the marriage went ahead, that Andrew defended it, and that the fortune held. Whether the marriage was in itself a happy one is not a question the surviving record answers cleanly. The escalation this anthology is tracking begins here, at the case that shows the machinery only worked when the family had both the will and the instrument. The Carnegie family had the will. Lucy Carnegie was as opposed to Nancy's marriage as any mother in this video. She simply did not have the instrument, because the instrument had been welded shut around the trust before the moment of the daughter's marriage. That is the escalation bridge into what follows. In the next segment, the father held the will himself, and he was, when the marriage broke, in the middle of a lifetime project of rewriting it against his daughter. He had already written 12 codicils. He was about to write a 13th. Chapter 5. The Banker's Daughter and the Irish Baron. Frank Work had begun in the office of Cornelius Vanderbilt and had built, by his own account and by the accounting of Wall Street, a personal fortune of $15 million. He was, in the New York of the 1860s, one of a certain generation of American Wall Street men who had come up in the shadow of Cornelius Vanderbilt in the years after the Civil War, had watched the Commodore consolidate his railroads through the 60s and the 70s, and had, by the time the Commodore died in 1877, leaving $105 million to his family, become one of the largest personal fortunes in the country in his own right. He was a stockbroker. He was Protestant, Anglo-Irish by extraction on the paternal side, American in every way of running his household and raising his daughters. He had a townhouse on Fifth Avenue. He kept a summer place in Newport. He was, on paper, exactly the kind of American Gilded Age patriarch a British aristocrat looking for a dollar princess bride was supposed to want. He did not want the aristocrat. He had, in 1880, allowed his elder daughter, Frances Ellen Work, known to her family as Fanny, to marry the Honourable James Boothby Burke Roche on the 22nd of September of that year at Christ Church in New York City. Burke Roche was Anglo-Irish gentry. His father was Edmund Roche, 1st Baron Fermoy. His elder brother Edward would in due course become the 2nd Baron Fermoy, and would then, in 1920, die without a male heir, at which point James himself would inherit the title and become the 3rd Baron Fermoy. In 1880, at the moment Fanny married him at Christ Church, he was simply the second son of an Irish peer, without a title of his own, without a Wall Street fortune of his own, with debts of the ordinary kind an Anglo-Irish gentleman of his generation carried, and with, in the Frank Work reading of the situation, exactly the kind of soft credentials that made the aristocrat marriage an aristocrat marriage. Frank Work had agreed to the marriage under protest. He believed and told his friends, and eventually told his daughter, that a Wall Street fortune of the size he had built should not be handed across the Atlantic to fund an Irish peer's expenses. The marriage lasted a little over 10 years. In the course of those years, Fanny had 4 children by Burke Roche. There was Eileen, the eldest daughter, who died in infancy. There was Cynthia, who would in her own turn marry twice, first to Arthur Scott Burden and second to Guy Fairfax Carey. There were the twin sons, Edmund Maurice and Francis George, born in the middle of a marriage that even at the birth of its healthiest children was already coming apart. Fanny filed for divorce in 1890, claiming desertion. Her lawyer was Thomas F. Bayard, the former United States Secretary of State. The divorce was awarded on the 3rd of March, 1891, in a New York proceeding that took its place among the notable American divorce cases of the year. Frank Work had never approved of the marriage and did not disguise, in the private correspondence and the semi-private drawing room conversation of the 1890s, that the divorce came as the confirmation of a judgment he had held from the start. Burke Roche went back to Ireland. Fanny stayed in New York with the twin sons and Cynthia. The sons, until 1920, when Burke Roche succeeded to the barony, went by the surname Work rather than Roche. That surname decision, small in itself, was the visible sign that the American side of the family was to be treated as the primary side. Frank Work was writing, without saying so, a first draft of the will he would spend the next 20 years rewriting. The years between the 1891 divorce and the 1905 second marriage were, in the shape of the Work household, the years in which the daughter and the father settled into the arrangement of a Fifth Avenue heiress living on her father's allowance. The allowance was substantial. It was also, in the manner of the Gilded Age paternal allowance, entirely at the father's discretion. When Fanny displeased him, he cut it. When she pleased him, he restored it. The fortune stayed his. In 1892, the American Society Press published Ward McAllister's official 400, the roster of New York families deemed suitable for Mrs. Astor's ballroom, which took its name from the reported fact that 400 people was the number that could fit into Caroline Astor's ballroom. Fanny appeared on the list. She was, at 35, one of the visible daughters of one of Wall Street's largest fortunes, divorced from an Irish peer, living in a townhouse on her father's money, riding daily in the parks and the country around New York. She rode with, among others, a Hungarian-born riding master named Aurel de Battogni. Battogni had come off the White Star liner Majestic in 1891, on the 8th of July of that year. On his 1895 naturalization application, he had described himself as an Austro-Hungarian count. He ran a Manhattan riding academy that catered to the same New York society class Fanny belonged to. He was, by the accounts that survive in the Newport Summer Press and the New York Society columns, tall, dark, an accomplished horseman, a linguist, a well-featured man with the standard equestrian competence of his class of continental instructor. His documented biography before his 1891 arrival in the United States was thin at the time and remains thin now. That thinness, which the Frank Work camp would in due course use against him in the papers, was not in itself unusual for an Austro-Hungarian coming into the New York City of the 1890s. The stories of the era's imported riding masters and dancing masters and language teachers were, as a class, thinly documented on their European side. The thinness became suspicious only when a Frank Work daughter tried to marry one of them. They met in 1903. According to Fanny's own later accounts to the divorce court, and according to the Newport summer coverage of the 2 years that followed, they were quite happy together. She encouraged Battogni to propose. He was, by her account, reluctant. The reluctance is worth flagging because it does not fit the picture Frank Work would in due course paint for the American papers, which was that Battogni was an adventurer who had targeted the Frank Work fortune. The record suggests the pursuit was more nearly the other way round. Fanny, aged 47, divorced these 12 years, in the middle of a New York life whose defining feature was that it was lived on her father's discretion, had met a man she wanted to marry, and had had to press him to say yes. He did say yes. On the 4th of August, 1905, in a private ceremony in New York City, Frances Ellen Work Burke Roche, at the age of 47, married Aurel de Battogni. She did not tell her father. She would keep the marriage from him for something over 5 months. He learned of it in early 1906 from the newspapers. Chapter 6. The Hungarian on the Horse. Aurel Battogni had come off the White Star liner Majestic in 1891 and claimed, on his own naturalization application, to be an Austro-Hungarian count. Whether he was one, and whether his real name was Battogni, or, as the papers instructed by Frank Work in 1906 would eventually suggest, Arthur Cohn, is a question the surviving record does not answer with any certainty. It matters to the segment less than it seems it should, because whatever the truth of the count question was, it did not change the marriage. The marriage, in the first 2 years, was by every available account a successful one. Fanny stayed in New York for the parts of the year Bertogni was teaching in his Manhattan academy. They summered together in Newport, in a Rhode Island cottage they eventually purchased or leased in Middletown, on the same island block where the Vanderbilt and the Belmont and the Astor summer places were arranged along Bellevue Avenue. Fanny had spent every summer of her adult life in that geography. She was on the arm of an Austro-Hungarian riding master rather than of an Irish baron, walking the same Ochre Point cliff walk she had always walked in the same summer season, in the same coloured light off the Atlantic. What was different was that the entire local society was watching to see what her father would do. Her father did the thing he had never yet, in the years of the Burke-Roche marriage, or the years of the intervening divorced widowhood, actually done. He wrote her out of the will. The precise date on which Frank Work first became aware of the marriage is not settled in the sources, but it lies in the first 2 or 3 months of 1906. It is a paper story before it is a family story. He read of it. The papers had it before he did. His response, when a New York reporter caught him on the front steps of his own townhouse for a comment, was captured in the phrase for which the entire episode is remembered by American genealogists. He said, of his own daughter, that she was nothing more to him. He then went to his lawyer and added the codicil to the will. It was the 13th codicil the lawyer had drafted for him against Fanny in the 25 years since he had made his first will, and it was the one that cut her out completely. The exact wording of the 13th codicil is not in the surviving public sources in full. The substance of it, reported in the New York papers of 1911, when the will was probated after his death, was that Fanny would receive nothing from the estate on the death of her father, that the estate would pass instead to the twin grandsons and to Fanny's sister Lucy Bond Work, and that no part of it would ever, under any construction of the will Frank Work's estate could permit, be permitted to reach either the Honourable James Boothby Burke-Roche or the man styled Aurel de Bertogni, no matter what happened to either of them in the years to come. The threat was, and was intended to be, financial death. Frank Work had a second instrument. He controlled the daily allowance on which Fanny lived. She was, at the moment he cut her out of the will, spending in her father's money at a rate that could not be sustained without him. The allowance was cut. The Newport summer became difficult. The New York fall season became more difficult still. The papers, prompted by hints from Frank Work's own office, began to run pieces suggesting that Bertogni's aristocratic pedigree was false, that his real name was Arthur Cohn, that he might still be married to a first wife in Hungary. The Newport summer press, which was almost entirely dependent on Frank Work's side of the story for its access to the Work household, ran the material. For nearly 2 years, the marriage held under this pressure. Fanny did not, in that period, capitulate. She stayed with Bertogni. She spent from what she had left. She spent in defiance. The record shows a woman in her late 40s determined to see how far the second marriage would take her against the standing pressure of her father's will. In October of 1907, she filed for divorce. The filing was not an act of independent conviction. It was, by her own later account, and by every version that reached the American papers, the product of a direct ultimatum from Frank Work. He had told her, and told her in front of witnesses, who reported it in one form to the papers and in another form to the divorce court, that if she remained married to Bertogni, she would not be restored to the will, and that if she divorced him, he would consider restoring her on terms he would set himself. She filed. The proceedings ran for 2 years. In the course of those proceedings, the papers reported, in a torrent of unattributed items whose origin was reasonably clear, that Bertogni had had affairs on his extended teaching travels, that he was allegedly still married to a woman in Hungary, that his aristocratic pedigree was fabricated. None of the specific claims was ever conclusively proved. All of them were sufficient, taken together, to produce the divorce Frank Work required. The divorce was granted, in Fanny's favour, on the 5th of November 1909. Bartogni received a financial settlement, which included the Middletown Villa and several other Rhode Island properties. He then, in the manner of a man in his position at the end of a New York society divorce, faded from the New York scene. He transferred the titles of his other properties into his mother's name. He appears in the record of the following decade in the fragmentary form typical of a divorced European in the pre-war years: a Red Cross registration at the American Consular Office in The Hague in 1914, various property transactions in Rhode Island through the neutral years of the war, and, in 1919, a seizure of his Rhode Island properties by the Office of the Alien Property Custodian on the alleged grounds that he had returned to Austria to fight for the Central Powers. Whether he did, and whether the seizures were, as later research suggests, a matter of abandonment and unpaid property tax more than of enemy sympathy, is not now recoverable. There is no record of Bartogni returning to the United States after 1919. Fanny's own financial support of him ceased in 1914 due to loss of contact, 5 years before the seizures. The divorce, in the accounting Frank Work required, worked. Fanny had been reduced from the wife of an Austro-Hungarian riding master to a formerly single American woman of 49 in the summer of 1910. Frank Work drew a new codicil. He restored her to the estate on terms he would spend the next year refining. The terms would become clear in the will he left at his death on the 16th of March 1911, 16 months after the divorce. Chapter 7. The Will and the Great-Granddaughter. When Frank Work died on the 16th of March 1911, his will restored his daughter to the estate, but only on precisely engineered terms. The estate at his death was reported in the New York probate coverage and cited in the New York Times report of 1922 under the headline Work Estate Accounting at $15 million. In the standard cost of living conversion used for a 1911 American dollar into a 2025 American dollar, that $15 million is approximately $417 million. It was one of the substantial personal fortunes of the New York Wall Street generation that had come up under Cornelius Vanderbilt. It was distributed between Fanny, her sister, and the twin grandsons Maurice and Francis, with trustees appointed for the American administration, and the specific requirement, written into the will, that no part of the estate was to pass to Fanny's first ex-husband, the Honourable James Boothby Burke Roche. Fanny's yearly allowance was capped at $80,000, which in the 2025 dollar is approximately $2.22 million. The cap was the entire architecture of the punishment. Under the terms of her father's will, she was to receive, for the whole of the rest of her life, a yearly allowance sufficient to sustain a Fifth Avenue townhouse, a Newport summer place, a New York domestic staff, and the ordinary expenses of a New York society widow in her mid-50s, and no more. She could not touch the principal. She could not deploy the fortune. She could not, most importantly to the man who had written the will, direct the fortune anywhere he had not authorized. Fanny complained, openly and often and to reporters, that she found it hard to run her household on $80,000 a year. The complaint, which the American papers dutifully reported through the 1910s and 1920s, was in itself the sharpest measure of what her father had done. In the New York City of 1911, $80,000 a year placed a household comfortably in the top 0.1% of American incomes. In the New York City of 1922, when Fanny was known to be complaining, it did the same. Her complaint was not literally that she was poor. Her complaint was that she was no longer, and could never again be, in a position to spend the fortune her father had built. The $80,000 a year was a cage in which she was allowed to walk. The bars of the cage were the codicils of a father who had spent 30 years writing them. The other named provision of the will worked in the same direction. The clause naming that no part of the estate could pass to her first husband was, on the day of Frank Work's death, unnecessary as a matter of American probate law, because Fanny had been divorced from Burke Roche for 20 years. It was included anyway. The reasoning was that Frank Work was setting up a defensive position against future contingencies. Burke Roche was in 1911 still alive. He would become the third Baron Fermoy in 1920 on the death of his elder brother, another 9 years hence. Frank Work had watched, in the years between the 1891 divorce and his own death, exactly the kind of Anglo-Irish gentleman his ex-son-in-law was becoming. He had determined, with the settled conviction of the entire life he had lived in the shadow of Cornelius Vanderbilt, that his fortune would not, under any construction of any American probate court that might in the future be persuaded to reopen the settlement, pass into the hands of an Anglo-Irish peer's estate. The clause was insurance against events that might unfold across the Atlantic long after Frank Work himself was in the ground. It named the peer by his full formal name, the Honourable James Boothby Burke Roche, so that no clerk in any future New York courtroom could pretend not to know who was intended. Fanny lived on the $80,000 a year for the rest of her life. She lived it for 36 years. She died at 1020 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan on the 26th of January 1947 at the age of 89. The New York Times obituary of the following day, under the headline, "Mrs. Burke Roche dead here at 90, reported her age as 90, an inconsistency with her birth date of the 27th or 28th of October 1857, which the standard genealogical reference works resolve in favour of the birth date arithmetic. She was 89. She had spent 36 years spending her father's cage allowance. She had never remarried after Battogni. Cynthia had married and remarried and had descendants. The twin sons had grown up. Maurice had, in 1920, along with his father, ceased to sign himself Work and had begun to sign himself Roche. He had, on the death of his father in 1921, inherited the barony as the fourth Baron Fermoy. That succession, small and remote in the New York papers of the 1920s, is what makes this segment of the video reach further into the 20th century than any other segment. Because Maurice, 4th Baron Fermoy, would in due course be, on the record of the standard genealogies of the British peerage, and on the confirmation of the BBC and the Genealogists magazine, cited in the source, the maternal grandfather of Diana, Princess of Wales. His daughter Frances married into the Spencer family. Her daughter Diana married the Prince of Wales, who is now king. Diana's sons are the Princes William and Harry. The great-grandmother of Diana, Princess of Wales, and the great-great-grandmother of the current heir apparent to the British throne, was a New York City heiress whose father had capped her at $80,000 a year for the crime of marrying a Hungarian riding master. The Diana line is not the reason the story matters. It is the late reveal that shows the shape of what a fortune eventually does. The Frank Work fortune did not, in the end, stay in Frank Work's American, non-titled ledger. The clause naming Burke Roche in the will did not keep the fortune out of the British peerage, or, eventually, out of the British royal family. The father, who had spent 30 years rewriting his will to keep his daughter inside his own class, had, on the arithmetic of the 4 generations that would follow her, been outrun by the choices of the daughter he had capped. The collapse to a single image in this segment is the 13th codicil, a New York lawyer's office, a wire from Frank Work's own hand. the sentence that his daughter was nothing more to him, delivered on the front steps of his townhouse to a reporter who wrote it down. The Frank Work fortune passed through the 80,000 a year cage. It passed through Cynthia, through the twin sons, through Maurice 4th Baron Fermoy, through Ruth, through Francis Spencer, into Diana, into the princes. It is on the throne now. The Work case worked in the terms Frank Work set it up, because the father held the paper. He wrote the will. He wrote the codicils. He controlled the allowance. He was, up to the day of his death, the sole author of what his daughter could and could not spend. In the next segment, the father is not in the story at all. The father is dead by the time the daughter marries. The instrument is not the will. The instrument is the pew. Chapter 8. The village that could not seat her. Williamsbridge was not Fifth Avenue and not Newport, but in the way of every American town of any size. In the 1890s, it had its own 2,000 people who defined what respectable meant. It sat in the northern part of Westchester County, between the Bronx River and the little rise of ground that later became the Bronx Park North Station on the New York and Harlem line. It was, at the moment, Ella Tice lived in it, a village of the older Westchester kind, before the extension of the city rapid transit absorbed the whole northern county into the outer Bronx. Its houses were frame, painted white, with wooden porches and small stables at the back. Its churches were Baptist and Methodist, and in one small clapboard building on the main road, Episcopalian. Its wealth was of the local respectable middle sort. There were no Vanderbilts and no Astors in Williamsbridge. There were, in a straightforward sense, the village used itself, its own quiet money, of a kind that maintained a household with a coachman and a cook and a laundry maid and a coach house behind the frame residence on the main street. The Tice family was of that quiet middle. It was Baptist. It was respectable. It had a pew in the Williamsbridge Baptist Church, which had been the family pew for as long as anyone in the congregation remembered. It kept a coachman. The coachman, at the moment this story begins, was a black man named James Randolph. The dates in this segment are the softest of the 4 segments. The New York Herald covered the case at the time. The scholarly historian Carolee Klimchok, whose work on the whole phenomenon of Gilded Age heiress coachman elopements is the standard secondary source, includes the Tice case among her documented 70. Klimchok's own citations to the Herald give the case in careful outline, but the precise year of the marriage, of the newspaper interview, of the Sunday morning at the Baptist church, and of the departure from Williamsbridge is not fixed in the public excerpts of her work available now. The best that can honestly be said is that the case is a late 1890s or very early 1900s case, in the last half-decade before the New York rapid transit boom began to change Williamsbridge from a quiet Westchester village into a small piece of the outer city. The script will therefore give it as a turn-of-the-century case in the soft dating the sources permit, and will fix nothing to a specific year the sources do not clearly support. The Tice case is in this anthology for a specific reason. The other 3 segments are Fifth Avenue money. Nancy Carnegie was rescued by a trust that could not have existed at any other economic scale. Frances Ellen Work was punished by a will that could not have functioned at any other economic scale. Victoria Morosini was chased by Pinkertons her father could afford to send across state lines and could reasonably expect to succeed. The private detective, the discretionary trust, the 7-figure codicil are all instruments of Fifth Avenue money. They cost money to operate. A Westchester Baptist household did not have any of them. If the class rule against heiresses marrying their servants had depended on Fifth Avenue instruments, it would not have reached into Westchester at all. It did reach into Westchester. It reached in without a lawyer's codicil, and without a Pinkerton, and without a discretionary trust. It reached in through the 4th instrument, the one the Fifth Avenue families themselves also had access to and did not so often need to use, which was the community. The pew, the Baptist congregation, the brother, the men of the village who, when the Tice household refused to disown her outright, took up the enforcement themselves. James Randolph is a thin figure in the record, a black coachman in a white Westchester household in the last years of the 19th century would not, in the ordinary course of the historical record, be documented at all. What the record has of him is entirely produced by the scandal, and even the scandal produced only a fragment. The New York Herald, reporting Klimchok cites, identifies him by name. It identifies him by his employment. It identifies him, in the era's word for a black man, as colored. That is essentially everything the surviving press said about him. He was Ella Tice's father's coachman, or Ella Tice's mother's coachman, or the coachman of a household of which Ella was, in her turn as the daughter of it, the mistress. He drove the family's carriage. He kept the horses. He lived, in the pattern of a Westchester household of that period, in a room over the coach house at the back of the property. He would have taken the family to the Williamsbridge Baptist Church on a Sunday morning. He would have driven Ella and her mother, and, before the mother's death, or the mother's confinement, or whatever it was that left Ella running her own household by the time this story begins, the family to the Grand Concourse, or to the country roads north of Williamsbridge in the late afternoon at the coaching hour. He was in the family's daily life in the way a Manhattan society coachman was in a Manhattan society family's daily life. He was, exactly to that degree, the same figure as Ernest Schilling and James Heaver and Orel Batogni, only in a household one economic level down. The interracial dimension is a second axis of the scandal on top of the class dimension. The scandal in the 4 Fifth Avenue cases in this video is exclusively a class scandal. The scandal in Williamsbridge is a class scandal and a race scandal at once, and the two dimensions are not separable in the response of the village. The Herald reporter, when he came out to Williamsbridge to interview Ella Tice, was writing for a paper whose subscribers took both dimensions of the scandal for granted. The reporter's own copy, and the copy of the parishioner whose response the paper printed alongside Ella's, reflects that. Both of the ways Randolph could be an unfit husband for a Tice were assumed. What the coverage was really about was Ella's insistence that the assumptions were, in her case, wrong. She insisted on it, in the record we have, in the sharpest language of any of the 4 women in this video. She was the only one who went to the papers. Chapter 9. The Happiest Woman in Westchester. Ella Tice went to the New York Herald and told a reporter, on the record and for publication, that she was the happiest woman in Westchester County and that the marriage was nobody's business but her own. The Herald printed it. The line, in the version Klimchok preserves in her research and quotes in her public radio interview, ran along these terms. She said, "You can tell all your readers." She said, "He loves me and I love him." She said, "It is nobody's business but our own." She named her husband as James Randolph. She confirmed that he had been the family coachman. She confirmed that she and Randolph had been married in a small private ceremony in the pattern of a great many other private ceremonies. In the 1890s New York borderland, where a woman of Ella Tice's local class was not, if her family disapproved, going to get a full white wedding in the Baptist church. She was open about the fact of the marriage. She was, in the reporter's transcription, not visibly worried about the local response. She should have been. But she was not. And it was that unworriedness which the Herald coverage seized on, and which made the interview the coverage it became. In the whole run of the 70 documented cases Klimchok has counted, the pattern was concealment. The other heiresses concealed their marriages for months, or for years, and revealed them when the revelation came, either as an accomplished fact after a period of absence, or through the intervention of a family member or a lawyer or a press office. Fanny Work concealed her marriage to Bertogni for 5 months. Nancy Carnegie concealed her marriage to Heva for over a year. Victoria Morosini, as we will come to, did not, once the elopement was discovered, sit down with the papers at any point in the following 20 years to explain herself. Ella Tice was the exception. She was the woman who, on the day the Herald came to her door, sat down in her own parlour and told the reporter what she had done and why she had done it, and she did it in words the whole city could read. The words provoked the response. The response, in the same Herald coverage or in coverage a few days later, ran under the headline that the peaceful village of Williamsbridge in Westchester County had never been so stirred to its depths as by the wedding of pretty Ella Tice to the coloured coachman James Randolph. The story went on that never had the good people of the Baptist Church been more deeply agitated than by the announcement, made by Mrs. Randolph herself in the same Herald, that she and her husband, regardless of what anybody might think, would walk boldly up the main aisle at the following Sunday's service and take their places in the Tice family pew as if nothing had happened. That announcement was the crisis, and the whole village understood that it was the crisis, and the paper duly went out into the village to see what the village would say back. The paper found what it went out to find. In the same coverage, an unnamed young man of Williamsbridge, whom the Herald called simply a hot-headed youth, was quoted responding on the record. The quotation, in the racist language of an 1890s Westchester Baptist youth, as the paper printed it, ran that if that darky dared to show his face in the Baptist church that night, there were men in the place who would just as soon, and a little sooner, give him a coat of tar and feathers. That is what the paper printed. That is the language of the period source, preserved here as historical evidence of the violence being threatened rather than as any editorial position of the narration. The line was one line among what must have been many in a village of Baptist Westchester in the 1890s, in which the general run of feeling of the young men of the community was that the coachman was not going to be permitted, on any Sunday, to sit in the Tice pew. Ella held the position she had taken. In the coverage that survives, she did not retract the interview. She did not, in the days between the printing of her line about being the happiest woman in Westchester and the Sunday morning at the church, make any statement suggesting that she had reconsidered. Randolph, in what surviving press we have from those days, said nothing publicly. The Herald reporter, in the last of the pieces on the case before the Sunday itself, was preoccupied with what would happen at the church door. There was, running in parallel to the church story, a second axis of the crisis inside the Tice family itself. The village's public response was one thing, the family's private response was another, and Klimchok's research surfaces it in a single sharp sentence that Ella's own brother threatened her life. The brother is not named in the surviving public excerpts of Klimchok's work. The nature of the threat is not detailed. What is detailed is that in the same week the Herald ran the Sunday morning cliffhanger about the Baptist church, Ella Tice was living in her own family home with a brother who had told her, in whatever form and with whatever specifics, that if she persisted in the marriage, he would kill her. The brother's threat is the sharpest of the family responses recorded in any of the 4 segments of this anthology. Frank Work told the reporter his daughter was nothing more to him. Giovanni Morosini, as we will see, told the reporter that if he could put his hands on Victoria's husband, he would tear him to pieces. But he specified in the same interview that the person he wanted to tear was the coachman, not the daughter. Lucy Carnegie refused to receive the couple, an entirely non-violent response of a Fifth Avenue widow of the 1890s. Ella Tice's brother, said he was going to kill her. He said it about the daughter, not about the coachman. The Fifth Avenue mechanism reserved the violence, in every case in this video, for the servant. The Westchester Baptist mechanism did not. The pew is the object of this segment. It has been the object since the announcement in the Herald that Ella and Randolph would take it. It is what the community meant by respectability. It is what the Tice family had held in Williamsbridge for as long as anyone remembered. It is what Ella, in the flat, plain sentence she gave the reporter, had proposed to take her black husband to sit in on a Sunday morning. It is the fixed physical thing the whole crisis was arranged around, and it is what the following Sunday would settle. Chapter 10. The Sunday morning at the Baptist Church. Whether the coachman James Randolph walked up the aisle that Sunday is the point at which the surviving press coverage phrase. What is certain is that Ella Tice's own brother, in the same week, threatened her life. The coverage phrase, because the crisis had been the announcement, not the resolution. The Herald had run the crisis, in the build-up pieces, with the anticipation of any American city paper of the 1890s in front of a small-town story with a violent threat attached. The paper then, in the pattern of the era, moved on. The line about the couple taking the pew and the line about the tar and feathers response were the lines the whole city had come to see. The Sunday morning itself, in the surviving public excerpts of Klimchok's research, and in the small fragments of the original Herald coverage that have been reprinted since, is not fully documented. There is no printed account of Randolph walking up the aisle in his best Sunday coat. There is no printed account of the men of the village stopping him at the door. There is no printed count of the number of parishioners who came to see the promised scene played out. What there is, in the record Klimchok has assembled, is the outcome. Ella Tice and James Randolph left Williamsbridge. They went, in the specific way Klimchok frames it, to New York City, which was in the 1890s the standard destination of American couples in cross-race or cross-class marriages who needed a larger city to live in with less continuous local surveillance. The village they had chosen to marry in was not the village they were going to be permitted to live in. The pew they had proposed to sit in on the Sunday morning was, whether they attempted it that Sunday or not, no longer available to them for any Sunday after. The Tice family did not, on the available record, reconcile with them. The brothers' threat, whatever specific form it had taken, was one of the reasons they left. Klimchok's own reading of the case, in the public radio interview, is that this pattern of departure was the ordinary outcome. The mob is the fourth instrument on the list of 4 this video began with. The lawyer's codicil could disinherit a Fifth Avenue daughter. The convent could hold a Fifth Avenue daughter behind a door for a season. The Pinkerton could pursue a Fifth Avenue daughter across state lines. The mob, in the form the 1890s American Baptist village used it, drove the daughter out of the town. It did not need money to operate. It did not need lawyers. It did not need private detectives. It needed a congregation and a pew and a Herald interview to trigger the response. The 4 instruments are, in an accounting they are not usually given, on the same list precisely because they are on the same list. The Fifth Avenue family had all 4 at its disposal. It used, in the ordinary run of a Fifth Avenue coachman elopement, the codicil first, because the codicil was the cheapest and the cleanest and the most easily explained to a grand jury if the case ever reached one. It used the convent second, if the codicil failed and the daughter was still too young to be beyond the family's physical reach. It used the Pinkerton third, if the elopement was fresh enough and the couple was in transit and there was still a chance of intercepting them before the marriage was solemnized. It used the mob fourth, and it used the mob most reluctantly, because the mob was the instrument that always spilled into the papers and always did the family the greatest reputational damage in the process of delivering the daughter the greatest private harm. A Fifth Avenue family did not send tar and feathers because a Fifth Avenue family had no need to. A Fifth Avenue family had lawyers. A Westchester Baptist family in the Williamsbridge of the last years of the 19th century had only the fourth instrument. It did not have a Frank Work will structure. It did not have a Lucy Carnegie trust to protect the daughter from itself. It did not have a Giovanni Morosini Pinkerton account with a New York detective agency. It had a pew. It had a brother. It had a congregation. It had the general village standing of the Tice family among the 2,000 people of Williamsbridge who defined what respectable meant. And when the daughter of the house went to the New York Herald and announced her intention to walk up the aisle with the coachman, the village used every ounce of what it had. It used the pew. It used the brother. It used the men of the village who would tar and feather the coachman if he showed his face. It used, in the plain descending sequence the whole segment has been tracking, everything a Westchester Baptist village of the 1890s could bring to bear on a daughter of the local respectable class. The instrument worked. Ella Tice disappeared, in the specific meaning of the word disappearance the paper of the 1890s used, from the Williamsbridge Village record. She and Randolph, in the fragmentary surviving coverage, lived on in New York City for at least some period of years. New York City, in the last years of the 19th century, absorbed, in the ordinary course of its own working geography, a great many couples in similar positions. Klimchok's broader research on the whole 70 case pattern documents that the standard exit strategy for a coachman-heiress couple that had been driven from the family town was to disappear into a New York boarding house district in the same borough of Manhattan that Victoria Morosini and Ernest Schilling would in their turn disappear into after the Bowery vaudeville years wound down. The Yorkville tenements, the West Side rooming houses, the Harlem apartments before the Great Migration of the 1910s changed the neighborhood. The specific address at which Ella Tice and James Randolph lived after Williamsbridge is not, in the current public research, recovered. What the pattern of the era tells us is that they lived in one of them. There is no further herald follow-up on the marriage. There is no printed obituary in the New York papers under either the name Tice or the name Randolph that has been surfaced in the public research to date. The story ends with the departure from Williamsbridge, in the pattern of every story of the era in which the woman had made a private life. The papers of the 1890s could not sustainably print about. The paper had printed the crisis. The paper had not needed to print the resolution, because the paper's own coverage was the resolution. The Herald had told the village what the daughter had done. The village had told the daughter what it would do to the coachman, and the daughter had left. That is the shape of the mob instrument as it worked in the American Baptist village of the 1890s. It did not require a printed follow-up. It was self-executing. The last observation of the segment is the specific one about the brother. Ella Tice's own brother, in the same week, her line about being the happiest woman in Westchester ran in the paper, told her he would kill her if she persisted in the marriage. That threat, in the whole run of the 4 segments in this video, is the sharpest single family response any of the 4 women received. Frank Work told a reporter his daughter was nothing more to him. That is a public renunciation. It is not a threat of physical violence. Giovanni Morosini told a reporter that if he could put his hands on Victoria's husband, he would tear him to pieces. That is a threat of violence, but it is directed at the coachman, not at the daughter. Lucy Carnegie refused to receive the couple. That is a social sanction, not a physical one. Andrew Carnegie's opposite response is not, in this accounting, in the same column, because Andrew was the uncle who overruled the mother. Ella Tice's brother said he was going to kill his sister. He said it about the sister, and not about the coachman. The Fifth Avenue reservation of violence for the servant did not, in the Westchester Baptist village, hold. The village's own threat was against the coachman, in the specific promise of the tar and feathers coat, but the family's own threat was against the daughter. That is the specific escalation from Fifth Avenue to Westchester. In the Fifth Avenue case, the servant was the enemy and the daughter was the disappointment. In the Westchester Baptist case, the servant was the enemy and the daughter was also the enemy. She had made herself a second target by refusing to concede the first one. The escalation bridge into the next segment is a bridge from one instrument to all four of them at once. The Tice case worked because the community delivered the punishment the family could not. It worked without a will, without a Pinkerton, without a convent, and with only the informal violence of a Westchester village to enforce it. In the frame subject that follows, the father delivered every single one of the four instruments the era had invented against a rebellious daughter, and it was still, in the accounting of the 20 years that followed, not enough. Chapter 11. The Doge of Elmhurst. Giovanni Pertinax. Morosini had come off a Boston ship in 1850, sent by an American consul with no money and no English, and by 1884 he was Jay Gould's business partner and one of the richest immigrant financiers in the country. He had been born in Venice in 1832, in the last quiet decade of the Habsburg administration of the Veneto. The Morosini surname was one of the ancient patrician names of the Venetian Republic. It had been carried in the 8 centuries of the Republic before its extinction at Napoleon's hand in 1797, by doges and by admirals and by cardinals and by governors of the Sea Empire. And by 1832, it was the surname of a great many Venetians of every social grade who had inherited it from those ancestral connections. The Giovanni Morosini of this story was not born to money. His family in Venice was of the working small artisan and manual labour sort. He grew up on the Cali off the Cannaregio. He learned no English as a child. His schooling was Venetian and Italian. He was, in the accounting of the American papers, who would eventually write him up in the 1870s and 1880s, an immigrant boy of the same class as the immigrants coming off the same Genoese ships to New York and Boston in the same decades. In 1848, he joined the Patriot forces in the revolt against Austrian rule in the Veneto. The revolt failed. In the general amnesty that followed the Habsburg reconquest, Giovanni fled the country. He arrived in Smyrna, the port on the Anatolian coast, in the flight of the failed patriots of the Year of Revolutions. From Smyrna, he was sent by an American consul who took him under his wing without further consultation than the consul's own view of the young man's prospects, to Boston. He arrived in Boston in 1850. He had no money and no English. He was 18 years old. He came down the coast to New York City. He found work in the candle factory of Giuseppe Garibaldi, the Italian revolutionary hero of the 1848 uprising, who was at that period living in exile in New York and running a small candle factory in the city. Garibaldi hired the young Morosini in the ordinary way of a small factory hiring an out-of-work Italian immigrant of the exile generation. Morosini worked for him. He sailed with him. When Garibaldi returned to Europe, Morosini went with him as a sailor on the same voyage, a voyage that took them to China and to England. Morosini came back to New York in the middle of the 1850s as a working sailor with an unusual biography and no fortune. The transformation happened on a New York waterfront on a night in 1855, in an incident that reads like the founding legend of a self-made American fortune, and, in this case, is almost exactly what happened. Walking on the waterfront one evening, Morosini came upon a small mob of youths who were beating a boy. He intervened. he drove the youths off. The boy, once the crowd had scattered and the two of them stood alone, turned out to be the son of Nathaniel Marsh, the secretary of the Erie Railroad. Marsh, when he was told what had happened, gave the young Italian an office boy position with the Erie Company on the 25th of May, 1855. The date is preserved in the Erie's own employment records and appears in every subsequent biographical treatment of Morosini in the American financial press. From that office boy position, Morosini rose. He learned bookkeeping. He worked his way through the Erie's accounting departments in the years of the Civil War. He was appointed general auditor. He met, in 1868, the man whose confidence would carry him into the top ranks of American finance. He met Jay Gould. Gould was, in the American public memory of the Gilded Age, the era's most feared and most hated railroad and telegraph consolidator. He was a man who trusted almost no one. He did not have partners in the sense the older Wall Street families of the 1860s had partners. He had instead a small circle of men whose competence he had personally verified and whose loyalty he could count on. Giovanni Morosini was in that small circle. Morosini was Gould's business partner in the standard American press description of the 1870s and 1880s. The house the Morosini fortune bought was on the Riverdale side of the Bronx, north of the older Manhattan estates and south of the Yonkers County line. The exact property is not fully surfaced in the public research to date. The New York press coverage of the 1880s and the Time magazine archive reference to Morosini as the Doge of Elmhurst point to a Riverdale mansion of the standard scale for a New York financier of Gould's inner circle. There was, in the household, a substantial staff. There was a coach house. There were stables of the Central Park coaching hour kind, kept up for the family's daily riding and driving. There was a general Riverdale establishment, appropriate to the 8-figure fortune Morosini had built. The American papers of the 1880s were snobbish about him in the specific way they were snobbish about a whole class of first-generation immigrant financiers of the Gould inner circle. They called him a codfish aristocrat. They called him the Doge of Elmhurst. They noted his Venetian name and made much of the coincidence, or the pointed choice, of a Venetian patrician surname carried by a man whose father had been a working artisan on the Cali. They implied, in the general run of the 1880s, New York society press's coverage of any first-generation immigrant of great wealth, that he was pretending to be what he was not. He was not, in his own view, pretending. He was, in his own view, exactly what he was. He was the man who had come off a Boston ship in 1850 and had risen to Jay Gould's confidence. And he had a daughter of 25 in 1884, in whom the whole arc of his life since the Venice waterfront was now embodied. He had, when Victoria was born, decided already that she was going to be everything the New York papers would eventually be forced to acknowledge that a Morosini daughter was. She was going to marry, when the time came, into the class the American papers had refused to concede him. She was going to complete the transformation his own biography could not complete. She was going to be the Morosini who was, at last, undeniable. She was going to marry the coachman. Chapter 12. 9 months in the stables. Victoria Pertinax Morosini was 25 years old in the summer of 1884, riding daily around the family estate in Riverdale with a German-born live-in coachman named Ernest Schilling, who had, by the standard of the era in which coachmen were hired partly for their looks, the physical presence the era's rich hired for. She had been raised in Giovanni's money. The details of her childhood are thinner in the public research than her elopement, but the outline is not in doubt. She had grown up in the Riverdale household. She had, as the eldest daughter of a household of Giovanni's scale, come out into New York society at 17 or 18 in the way of a Riverdale heiress in the middle 1870s. She had ridden and driven since childhood. She was, in 1884, one of a small handful of daughters of first-generation American immigrant fortunes on the border between the older Anglo-Dutch New York class and the newer immigrant financiers of Jay Gould's inner circle. She was, on paper, a candidate for the same class of arranged marriage into an older Anglo-American family that Frank Work had allowed his daughter to make with Burke Roch. Giovanni, in the reading his own quoted words in the New York press make clear, had assumed she would marry. He had assumed it in the specific structure of the Gilded Age paternal assumption. He had assumed that at some point in her mid-20s, an appropriate suitor would present himself, that the suitor would be of an older New York family, that a settlement would be arranged, and that Victoria would marry inside the Anglo-American class. He had assumed she would in effect be the seal on the Morosini fortune's admission into the class the American papers had denied him. He had also, in exactly the manner of every Gilded Age patriarch this video has followed so far, arranged the daily life of his household so that this assumption could be met while she rode with, ate with, and lived alongside a coachman who was young and well-featured and imported. Ernest Schilling had come out of Germany at some earlier date in the 1870s or the earliest 1880s. He had, in the manner of a great many German immigrants of that decade, coming into the American East Coast cities, taken up a trade the German immigrant labor of that period was overrepresented in, and had made his way from that trade into the household of a New York financier of the Morosini scale. He was young. He was a working coachman of the standard Gilded Age imported European kind Carolee Klimchok has described in her research. He had, by the accounting, the New York papers reconstructed in the year after the elopement, been in the Morosini household for something under 2 years at the moment of the elopement. He was Victoria's father's coachman. He was, in the household's daily arrangement, in the way of every American household of that scale, the man on the box. He drove her. He drove her mother. He drove her father to the ferry when Giovanni went down to the Erie offices on Lower Broadway. He was in the coach house in the morning. He was in the stables in the afternoon. He was in the barn at the back of the property in the evenings. He was, in the whole run of Victoria's daily household life through the winter and spring of 1884, the male figure of her own age with whom she had the largest number of unchaperoned hours in the ordinary week. The chaperone problem is the whole point. Victoria was in the Riverdale household in the pattern of an unmarried Fifth Avenue daughter. Her interactions with a man of her own class were governed by the standard chaperone rules of the 1880s American upper class. She did not sit alone with a young man of the Morosini circle. She did not receive a young man in her father's drawing room without another female present. She was, in every social situation that had been designed to expose her to a possible suitor of her own class, effectively supervised. The one social situation that had not been so designed was the one she spent the largest number of hours in. She was, in every carriage ride and every stable morning and every horseback afternoon in the country north of Riverdale, alone with the coachman. He was her chaperone. Klimchok's research on the mechanics of the whole coaching phenomenon across the 50 years makes this the specific structural point. The Gilded Age had produced a chaperone system whose central assumption was that a coachman was not, and could not be, a suitor. On that assumption, the entire architecture of the daughter's daily supervised life rested. The assumption was systematically wrong. The physical proximity the chaperone system had built between the young, unmarried daughter of a great fortune and the young, unmarried imported coachman was, over the course of a season, exactly the physical proximity most efficient at producing a marriage. The season in question, in the Riverdale household in the winter and spring and early summer of 1884, produced one. The record does not tell us the specific moment. There is no dated first meeting, no dated first exchange of confidences, no dated first embrace. The record has the elopement in September of 1884 and the 9-month romance which the New York papers of the following year reconstructed in retrospect, in the manner in which the American press of the 1880s reconstructed the romances of any heiress they had reason to be interested in. The 9 months tracks back to the previous winter. It sits in the season Klimchok's research would predict for a coachman-heiress attachment, exactly where such an attachment would have flowered under the conditions the household had created. They rode together. They spent in the ordinary weekly rhythm of a Riverdale household in the season, some hours in the coaching hour in Central Park at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, with Ernest on the box in front of Victoria, and with the ritual of the fashionable coaching drive around Bethesda Terrace and the Bow Bridge in its full performance. They spent, in the more informal weekly rhythm, longer hours in the country roads north of Riverdale, where the Morosini family took their horses out for the standard 3 or 4 hour ride of a Riverdale afternoon in the 1880s. She would have sat on the box beside him on those rides. She would have handed him the reins. She would have watched him work the horses through the country lanes of the last decade before the paving of Riverdale changed everything about the geography. There is no letter of Victoria's that survives in the current public research. There is no diary entry. What there is, in the general reading of the surviving material, and in the specific reading Klimchok's scholarly work provides, is a young woman of the 1880s American upper class who had come to a specific and considered decision over 9 months about the coachman. She was going to marry him. She knew what her father would do if she attempted it inside the household. She was going to elope. She was 25. She had a fortune waiting for her that ran into the millions of dollars her father had accumulated in the Erie and the Gould partnership. She had a Riverdale house, a Newport summer season available to her if she wanted it, an entry into a Fifth Avenue drawing room she had only to accept. She was going to walk away from all of it. Chapter 13. The 9th of September, 1884. On the 9th of September, 1884, in Troy, New York, Victoria Morosini eloped with Ernest Schilling, and her father, who had spent 30 years building the machinery of a New York financier's power, deployed all of it against his own daughter. They went by train. The specific line is not preserved in the current public research, but the geography is, and it is worth walking through in the plain sequence of a September elopement of the 1880s. Riverdale sat on the Hudson River line north of Manhattan. Troy sat 150 miles north, at the head of navigation on the Hudson River, at the point where the river turned toward the Erie Canal at Albany. Troy, in 1884, was a working American industrial city of foundries and shirt factories and the collar and cuff trade. It was, for a runaway couple leaving Riverdale, the first American city large enough to lose themselves in without leaving the state, and it was on a train line that ran up the Hudson without requiring them to change at any of the smaller stops in Westchester where the Morosini family would have been known. They went to Troy, because Troy was where a runaway couple went in 1884. The specific details of the elopement itself, the boarding house they went to on arrival, the exact wording of the marriage certificate, the identity of the minister or the justice of the peace who married them, are not in the current public research. What is preserved is the fact of the elopement on the 9th of September and the age of the daughter at 25, and the identity of the coachman as Ernest Huelskamp Schilling of the Riverdale household. What is preserved above all is what Giovanni Morosini did once he discovered the elopement. He did 4 things, in the specific order the surviving press coverage reconstructs. He hired Pinkerton detectives. This was the first and, in his own reading of the situation, the most important of the four. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency had by 1884 been in operation for nearly 30 years, since Alan Pinkerton had founded it in Chicago in the 1850s, and it had built, in the 2 decades since the Civil War, the specific private security capacity a New York financier of Morosini's scale would call on in a family crisis. The Pinkertons went up to Troy. They tracked the couple through the city. They came close. He had Victoria charged with the theft of jewellery. This was the second, and it was the instrument that in the accounting of the New York papers made him look ridiculous. The jewellery in question was jewellery he had bought for her and that she had worn as her own for years, in the standard practice of an 1880s American Gilded Age household, where the daughter's jewellery was in effect the family's jewellery under the daughter's daily care. Morosini took the technical legal position that the jewellery, having been bought with his money, remained his property, and that Victoria, in taking it up to Troy, had committed theft. The theft charge was filed. It collapsed in the way any American court in 1884 would have collapsed a father's theft charge against a 25-year-old daughter for the removal of her own jewellery. The papers, having reported the filing with the ordinary front-page treatment of a Morosini legal action, reported the collapse with the more entertained treatment of a New York father who had, on his own behalf, filed a charge that was not going to hold and had exposed himself to the amusement of the entire American reading public in filing it. He disinherited her. This was the third, and this was the one that held. He gave the papers the quotation. This was the fourth, and this was the one that outlasted the fortune, outlasted the disinheritance, outlasted the Pinkertons, outlasted the theft charge, and became the single most quoted period source on the whole 50-year phenomenon. He said, and the paper wrote it down, the following: "My Victoria was the light of this home, the delight of her mother, the very pride of my life, and she has disgraced us all. My God, if I could put my hands on that villain, I would tear him to pieces. Oh, sir, you do not know how happy we were. I gave her $200 a month, horses, diamonds, anything she wanted. I supposed she would marry. But I did not think my beautiful Victoria would marry a dirty stableman who washed his clothes in a horse trough." That is the quotation. That is Giovanni Morosini, standing in the drawing room of his Riverdale house in the second week of September 1884, talking to a New York reporter who had come out from the city to see what he would say. The interview ran, in the papers of the following days, in the whole run of the American press. It was reprinted in Kansas. It was reprinted in Oregon. It reached, in the standard American wire syndication of the 1880s, into every state and territory of the country. It made Victoria Morosini, on the description of the Kansas paper that Klimchok cites in her scholarly research, perhaps the most talked-about person in the country in the autumn of 1884. Two specific things about the quotation are worth pausing on, because they will carry the whole rest of the segment. The first is the $200 a month. In the 1884 American dollar, $200 a month was approximately $2,400 a year, and in the 2025 American dollar, it comes to something in the neighborhood of $6,600 a month, or $80,000 a year. It is, by an accident of period accounting, that would not have been visible to Giovanni at the time, and would not have been visible to any of the American papers in 1884. The same figure that Frank Work would in 1911 cap Frances Ellen Work at, out of a $15 million estate. That accident is not a coincidence. It is the specific dollar figure the Gilded Age American paternal accounting had settled on as the correct annual expense of maintaining a daughter of the class in question in the household style of the class. $200 a month for Victoria, $80,000 a year for Fanny. The Gilded Age had a settled number. The second is the phrase about the horse trough. It is the phrase the whole rest of the video's title carries. It is a dirty stableman who washed his clothes in a horse trough. It is the collapse to a single image of Giovanni Morosini's private disgust at the class transgression he was watching his daughter commit. It is, in one 13-word phrase, everything that the entire Gilded Age would spend 50 years and 70 documented cases and hundreds of thousands of column inches of newspaper coverage saying about the coachman. The stableman is dirty. He washes his clothes in a horse trough. He is not a man a daughter of the class can marry. And Giovanni Morosini, the Doge of Elmhurst, said it in the drawing room of his own Riverdale house, in a house full of coachmen and horse troughs of his own hire, on the assumption that no reporter had ever noticed that the stableman he was describing had been on the box in front of his daughter for 2 years, and was there because Giovanni himself had hired him. The disinheritance was the paperwork that followed. Giovanni instructed his lawyer to remove Victoria from the will. The will had, up to that point, contained the standard provisions for the elder daughter of a Gould Inner Circle Wall Street fortune. It had contained her share. It had contained her direct provision. The clause was struck out. Victoria was no longer, from that day, in the accounting of the Morosini estate, a Morosini heir. She was on a train from Troy to New York City in the same weeks. She was, on the arm of the coachman, walking off the last of Giovanni's power to retrieve her. She had lost the fortune. She had lost the Riverdale house. She had lost the standing invitation into the same American upper-class Frank Work's daughter would spend her whole life inside on $80,000 a year. She had, in exchange, one German coachman who was going to work in New York City for a wage he could earn as a working man. She was going to marry him. She was going to stay married to him. And she was going, in the years that followed, to make a working life on the New York vaudeville stage. Chapter 14. The Convent, the Vaudeville Stage, the Sixth Avenue Conductor. After the theft charge collapsed, and after the Pinkertons failed to catch them in time, Victoria Morosini spent a period at a convent of the Sisters of St. Joseph, and then, when she left it, went on to the New York vaudeville stage. The convent period comes first in the sequence, and is the part of the story where the surviving record leaves the most open. The Sisters of St. Joseph maintained houses in New York State in the 1880s, one of them in Rutland, Vermont, which is the specific house mentioned in some later accounts of Victoria's post-elopement year, and one in the New York City area. The specific house Victoria went to, and above all the specific circumstances under which she went to it, are not in the current public research with any certainty. What can be said is that she was there. What cannot be said cleanly is whether she was there of her own will, in the pattern of a young married woman who had gone through a family crisis and wanted a period of retreat, or whether she was there under family pressure of the kind Klimchok's research documents in a number of the 70 cases in the pattern of the 1880s American family who used the convent as an informal confinement instrument to try to break the marriage. Some accounts of the case have her returning from the convent divorced from Schilling. Some have her still married. The sources on this specific point differ. What the sources agree on is that when the convent period ended, whether it lasted 6 months or 18 months or 2 years, Victoria and Schilling were reunited in New York City, and Victoria began her second career. The second career was the New York vaudeville stage. The New York vaudeville circuit in the 1880s and 1890s was, in the specific sense that the American theatre historians of that period use, the circuit of the working popular theatre in the American cities. It ran from the Bowery in Lower Manhattan, up through the smaller theatres of the East Side, the West Side, and eventually the outer boroughs, in a network of 10-cent and 25-cent halls, where the acts turned over 3 times a week, and the paying audience was the working New York middle class of the day. It was not the legitimate stage of Fifth Avenue and the fashionable theatres. It was the popular stage of the Bowery and the working city. It was where an act of the kind Victoria offered, in the 2 years after her elopement, was the specific attraction the paying audience had come to see. The act, in the description Klimchok's research assembles from the surviving reviews, was Victoria, in a black or dark dress with a mandolin, singing and dancing, in the standard female vaudeville turn of the era. It was not, in the professional evaluation of the reviewers of the day, a particularly gifted turn. Klimchok notes that reviewers repeatedly said she did not have a strong singing voice. That was not the point. The point, which every reviewer who wrote her up in the 1880s or the early 1890s Bowery press specified, was that the paying audience had not come for the song. It had come for Victoria. It had come, more precisely, for the reenactment. Schilling, in the routine that the Bowery halls settled into for the Morosini act, would walk her up onto the stage. He would deliver her to the mandolin. In some accounts, though this specific detail is one of the ones the surviving record softens on, he would appear in the act itself as a version of the coachman he had been in Riverdale. The full performance of the elopement was not the whole act every night. It was the framing. It was the marketing. The audience had come to see the millionaire's daughter and the coachman perform their own scandal, and the walking up of the stage was the visible short form of that scandal, and the whole Bowery understood the reference. Her billing was Mrs. Ernest Huelskamp Schilling. She was not billed as Victoria Morosini. She was billed as her married name in its most complete form, because the entire marketing of the act depended on the fact of the marriage. She was, in the specific classificatory sense of the vaudeville circuit, a specialty act built around a topical scandal. She was one of a number of such acts on the Bowery in the 1880s, in the general run of a circuit that specialized in the topical and the sensational. She was, unusually, for the specialty act as a category, an act with a genuinely well-known real biography behind it. Most specialty acts of the era were making up their biography. Victoria was performing her real one. The economics of the marriage are, in the specific arithmetic that carries the emotional weight of the segment, the arithmetic of the $2 a day. Schilling worked in the years the Bowery Act ran, and in the years after, it eventually ran itself out as a 6th Avenue streetcar conductor. The 6th Avenue elevated line ran from downtown Manhattan up through the 9th Avenue side of the west side of the city, and its conductors were the working men of the New York transportation industry of the 1890s. The wage, in the reported later New York Herald description of Schilling's work, was $2 a day. It was, in the standard working New York wage of the 90s, the wage of a working transit man. It was a living wage. It supported the couple in the standard tenement or rooming house pattern of the working New York of the period. It was not, in any comparison to the household of the Morosini in Riverdale, a wage of any comparison at all. The mathematics is the part that will not go away. Giovanni Morosini had, in his own quoted words in the Riverdale drawing room in September 1884, said that he had given his daughter $200 a month. That is 100 times $2. And if a Riverdale monthly allowance of $200 is set against a 6th Avenue daily wage of $2, the ratio is fixed. The daughter had lived on 100 times the wage her husband earned in a day for the household. She now lived on a wage her husband earned in a day for the household. The number was the same, 2, and the unit had changed. $200 a month had become $2 a day. The unit of the household economy had collapsed by a factor of 30 across the 2 years between the Riverdale coach house and the 6th Avenue streetcar. The collapse is not, in the emotional accounting the segment has been building, a defeat. It is what she had traded for. She had, on the 9th of September 1884, in a Troy boarding house, made a specific and considered decision to accept the trade. She had accepted, at 25, that the Riverdale $200 a month was going to be exchanged for the 6th Avenue $2 a day. She had, on the arm of the coachman, walked onto the vaudeville stage in the black or dark dress with the mandolin, and performed her own scandal for the paying audience of the Bowery, and she had done it for years. She stayed with him. She was, in the last documented image of the segment, on the Bowery, going on into her 40s, with her husband still walking her up onto the stage. Chapter 15. The Woman Behind the Black Veil. A New York Herald reporter caught her, some years into her Bowery career, in the description that would become the single most quoted image of any Gilded Age heiress fall. The reporter had gone down to see her. The paper had run the elopement itself as a front-page story in September 1884, and it had run the follow-up coverage through the fall of that year, and it had come back to her periodically through the 1890s, whenever a new theatre engagement, or a new interview, or a new detail of the reenactment came up. The specific date of the piece the reporter filed the surviving passage in is not, in the current public research, fixed, but it lies in the middle to late 90s, in the period between the first Bowery act and whatever the second act of Victoria's working stage life eventually became. It is the passage that has, more than any other single sentence in the whole coverage of the whole 50-year phenomenon Klimchok has documented, come to stand for the woman. The reporter wrote, in the sentence that would in due course be quoted back in Klimchok's scholarly work as the collapse to a single image detail of the entire Gilded Age heiress fall category, the following: "She has grown somewhat stouter since the days when she danced in tights with mandolin and song at the casino, while her German husband made $2 a day as a 6th Avenue conductor. Her hair, the glimpse of it one can see behind her black veil, is still brilliant and without a trace of age or grief. She is an enigma, and she will so remain unless she chooses to surrender her secret." Every clause of the sentence is worth reading slowly. She has grown somewhat stouter. This is the reporter's first move. He is telling his reader that the woman who was, at 25, the light of one of the great immigrant fortunes of New York City, is now, at 40 or 42 or 45, older. Her body has changed. She has spent a decade or more on the Bowery stage and on the 6th Avenue streetcar economy, and her body carries the 10 years. The reporter does not editorialize on it, he notes it. He is a Herald reporter of the 1890s American press, and he is doing what a Herald reporter of the 1890s did, which was to record the surface as he saw it and let the reader work out the underneath. Since the days when she danced in tights with mandolin and song at the casino. This is the reporter's second move. He is placing her, in the plain past tense of the New York vaudeville circuit of the 1880s and the earliest 90s, in the specific working geography of the working stage. The casino is one of the Bowery halls. The tights are the vaudeville costume of the era. The mandolin and song are the specific act. This is the working career the paying audience had come to watch. It is on the record. He is not, in the plain phrasing, being cruel. He is being descriptive. While her German husband made $2 a day as a 6th Avenue conductor. This is the sentence that carries the whole segment. It is the specific working number. It is the direct, no adjective, 3-line sentence that places the coachman she had eloped with in his working position of the New York City of the last decade of the 19th century. He is a 6th Avenue conductor. He makes $2 a day. The mathematics that has been implicit for the whole video up to this point is now on the page in one plain clause of a Herald reporter's sentence. Her hair, the glimpse of it one can see behind her black veil, is still brilliant. This is the reporter's fourth move, and it is the one that keeps the passage from being contempt. The reporter, having noted that the body has thickened, having noted the working career, having noted the $2 a day husband, notes that the hair is still brilliant. It is a small human observation about a woman he can see in front of him in a Bowery Hall or a 6th Avenue street. It is the writer's honest note. She is still, in the specific brilliance of her hair, the woman she was, and without a trace of age or grief. This is the reporter's fifth move, and it is where the passage becomes what it is. The reporter has, in the previous clauses, laid out every reason to expect grief: the elopement, the disinheritance, the convent, the vaudeville, the husband on $2 a day. He has laid them out honestly and without embellishment. And in the last observation of the sentence, he tells the reader that the woman does not carry the grief on her face. She carries no trace of it. She has, in the specific observation of a Herald reporter of the 1890s who has been sent out to see her, no trace of the accumulated defeat of the decade the paper's own front page had been publishing about her. She is an enigma, and she will so remain unless she chooses to surrender her secret. This is the reporter's last move, and it is the one that sits at the emotional peak of the entire video. The reporter, who has come to see the fall, has failed to see it. The woman he can see in front of him is not the woman his editor sent him to describe. The Herald had come for the wreckage. What he found was a woman who refused to be one. She is an enigma. She will so remain unless she chooses to surrender her secret. She did not choose to surrender her secret. There is no interview in the surviving public research in which Victoria Morosini Schilling sat down with a reporter and explained herself. She lived on into the 20th century. She died, according to the Find a Grave Memorial for Victoria Pertinax Morosini Schilling, in 1935. She was 76 or 77 at her death. She had been married from the 9th of September 1884 to the day of Schilling's death some earlier year in that 70-year sweep, to Ernest Hulskamp Schilling. She had lived, in whatever specific years and geography the record cannot fully assemble, the working life of a New York transit man's wife. She had held the position she took at 25 for the whole of the rest of her life. You have followed her, through this video, from the Bowery stage in the opening minute to this Herald sentence in the closing minute of her segment. The video has never, in the 2 hours between, permitted you to look away. It has taken you through the Doge of Elmhurst and the Pinkerton detectives, and the theft charge, and the disinheritance, and the $200 a month, and the convent, and the vaudeville. It has ended in the last documented image of her working life, with her husband in his conductor's uniform and her hair still brilliant behind the black veil. She was a Riverdale daughter of a Wall Street fortune. She spent her whole adult life a coachman's wife. She spent it without a trace of grief. That was the trade she made at 25. Chapter 16. The trade she made with her eyes open. The papers and the fathers had, in every case in this video, decided in advance to make an example of the woman, so that other daughters of other fortunes would watch her fall and take the lesson. The example, in every case, was the same one. The example was that a daughter of the class did not marry the coachman, the riding master, the coloured coachman, the imported instructor, the family servant, and if she did marry him, she would be disinherited, cut out of the will, driven from the village, or reduced to the Bowery stage. That was the lesson the family and the papers arranged. The lesson did not work. Between 1860 and 1910, 70 documented cases went into the American press, and Klimchok's research is confident that the real figure is significantly higher because the wealthiest American families of the era had a well-established ability to keep the story out of the papers. Every one of the 70 women, in Klimchok's counting, had read the previous cases in the papers before she made her own marriage. Every one of them knew what had happened to Victoria Morosini. Every one of them knew what would happen to her. Every one of them made the marriage anyway. The double coda this video promised in its opening chapter can now be delivered. The first coda is what each of the 4 women lost. Nancy Carnegie lost her mother's welcome. She kept, on the arithmetic of the Cumberland Island Trust, and on the strength of Andrew Carnegie's public defense, her share of the family fortune. She kept the Cumberland Island house. She kept the New York invitation. What she lost, and what she carried for the rest of her life, was the mother who had refused to attend the wedding. That is the specific loss of the Carnegie segment. That is the loss the trust structure could not compensate for. Frances Ellen Work lost 14 million and change out of the 15 million her father died possessed of. She spent the last 36 years of her life inside an $80,000 a year cage inside a Fifth Avenue townhouse she could no longer, in any operative sense, own. She lost the freedom to spend the fortune her father had built. What she kept was the household on 1020 Fifth Avenue. What she kept was her twin sons. What she kept, in the descendants she could not have foreseen at 23 when she married Burke Roche, and could not have foreseen at 47 when she married Batonnier, was a bloodline that in due course produced Diana, Princess of Wales, and that in due course reached the British throne. Ella Tice lost the pew, the family, the town. She lost, in the specific instrument the whole village of Williamsbridge used against her on a single Sunday morning, everything her local class had promised her. She lost the church. She lost the brother. She lost the village. She kept the coachman. She spent, on the fragmentary surviving record, the rest of her life with him in New York City, where the Baptist congregation of Williamsbridge could not reach her. Victoria Morosini lost everything. She lost the Riverdale house. She lost the Morosini fortune. She lost the standing invitation into the New York upper class. She lost, on the disinheritance her father wrote in September 1884, the Morosini name in the New York papers. She spent, in exchange, 50 years on the arm of Ernest Schilling, in the boarding houses and the vaudeville halls and the $2 a day economy of the working New York transit trades. She was, at 76 or 77, at her death in 1935, a woman who had made a specific trade at 25 and had never, on any evidence available to us now, taken a single step back from it. The second coda is what happened to the fortunes that punished them. The Morosini fortune, on Giovanni's death in 1908, was reported in the obituaries in the standard phrase of the era as amounting to several millions. It did not stay several millions. The Morosini heirs who did inherit, other than Victoria, are not prominent in the American financial record of the 20th century. The Riverdale mansion passed out of the family. There is no Morosini foundation, no Morosini building, no continuing Morosini presence in the American financial record. Giovanni had, in his last 2 decades, closed a fortune down around himself and his own name, and had punished the one daughter who had refused to marry inside the class, and on his death the fortune scattered without a foundation and without a name, and without a descendant continuous with it. The Work fortune took the second longest arc. It ran from Frank Work's 15 million in 1911, through Frances's cage for 36 years, through the twin sons who used the surname Work until 1920, and then Roche after, through Cynthia's descendants into the Burden and Carey lines of the American aristocracy, and through Maurice IV Baron Fermoy into Ruth Gill Roche, into Frances Roche Spencer, into Diana Spencer, and into the current British royal family. The Frank Work fortune is, in the operative sense, on the British throne. The father, who capped his daughter at $80,000 a year to keep his fortune inside the American, non-titled ledger, was, by the arithmetic of the 4 generations that followed her, outrun by the marriages of the daughter he had capped. Everything Frank Work had spent 30 years trying to prevent was, on the arithmetic of the century that followed his death, precisely what happened to his fortune. The Carnegie fortune took the longest arc. Lucy Carnegie's Cumberland Island Trust held. The island, and Dungeness itself, held until 1959, when Dungeness burned to the ground in the fire that made it one of the most photographed American ruins. Cumberland Island. National Seashore now runs the ruin and the visitor infrastructure that surrounds it. The Carnegie descendants, of whom Nancy was one, hold, through the trust their mother Lucy Carnegie built at the end of the 19th century, some part of the island and the sibling houses to this day. The Carnegie fortune, in this specific respect, is the one fortune of the 4 that most clearly outlasted the century in which it was built. It outlasted, of course, precisely because Lucy Carnegie had, before Nancy's marriage, tied the whole thing down. The Tice family fortune, if it can be called a fortune in the sense the other 3 can, did not survive as a public entity. The village of Williamsbridge was absorbed into the outer city in the 1910s and 20s. The Baptist church congregation moved. The pew Ella Tice had proposed to walk up the aisle to is not now in a Williamsbridge that would recognize the incident. She chose. That is the sentence this final chapter wants to end on, and it wants to end on it in the cascading form. The final chapter of a video of this shape can permit itself once. She chose. Every one of the 4 women chose. Nancy chose the riding master, knowing her mother would refuse. Fanny chose the Hungarian, knowing her father was writing the 13th codicil that afternoon. Ella chose the coachman, knowing her brother would say he would kill her. Victoria chose the stableman, knowing Giovanni would send the Pinkertons before she reached the Troy railway station. She chose. She chose. She chose. She chose. The video has to close, as it opened, with Victoria. She is the frame subject. She is the reason the video exists at all. And she is the woman in the Herald sentence, at 42 or 45, on the Bowery stage in the black veil, without a trace of age or grief. The button quote belongs to another woman, and it belongs to her because she is the one woman of the 4 who sat down with a reporter and told him, on the record and for publication, exactly what the trade had been. Ella Tice went to the New York Herald in a Westchester village in the last years of the 19th century, and, when the reporter asked her whether she understood what her marriage would cost her, said in the flat, plain sentence that carries the whole thesis of the whole video the following: "I am the happiest woman in Westchester County. It is nobody's business but our own." That is the last word. That is what a fortune is really for. If you loved this, comment where you are watching from and tell me which of these 4 women you think made the most honest trade: the Carnegie, the Work, the Tice, or the Morosini. I want to hear your reading of what a fortune is really for. Subscribe so you never miss the next long biography, and share this on Facebook in a family thread, wherever the women in your life still argue about what a fortune is really for. You are the reason I write these.